Hey, this is Mose Blauner.
And this is Ben Cohn, and you are listening to the War Boys podcast, available on all platforms.
Война тяжелая. На всякие там чеченские и так далее близко не похоже. Минимальный возраст, который мы берем, это 22 года. Если моложе, бумажка от ближайших родственников, то они не против. Максимальный возраст условно.
All right, so that was Yevgeny Prigozhin talking to some prisoners in a courtyard. I don't think I saw that before. He said that the oldest they would take is 50. That's pretty old.
I was surprised more by the like lower threshold.
Yeah.
So the youngest we take is 22.
Yeah, or if you have a parent or guardian. If you're
but how many guys now are still in contact with their parents and guardians? You notice that they're all just at the ends of their rope.
Yeah.
Think of a Soviet prison. That is exactly the core.
But imagine being like a 19-year-old guy in prison and you're like, you have to write to your mom or dad and being like, hey, is it okay if I join this meat like grinder?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's an excellent question. Do they actually check? Right?
Yeah. Or like, who's the parent who's like, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, you should totally do that.
I don't imagine they're doing hardcore background checks.
Oh, cannon fodder? Oh, that sounds great, sweetie. When do you start?
And so this is for the recruiting for the Wagner Group, a private military company that has led the charge in the Ukrainian war for Russia. Yevgeny Prigozhin can only be described as a Gollum-esque figure.
Mm-hmm. But he's just a fascinating guy, too. Like,
truly. We know about him mostly through the media as this sort of warlord figure. We sort of know about him as this enigmatic figure who burst onto the stage during the Ukrainian war, and really most people learned about him as he died when he was shot out of the sky by the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Or maybe during the coup attempt. I feel like he was in the news a lot because of that too as well, but you know,
definitely.
As soon as that happened, it was just a countdown to his death, basically.
But we wanted to know, like, where does this guy come from? Who is he more than just like a coup attempt and then a smoking crater in Kuvskaya Oblast?
Yeah. Oh, it turns out there's a lot more to know about this guy, and it goes way back, and it has to do with a lot of the biggest players in Russia, including Putin himself. And if you guess that they had a deep personal connection, you're probably right, because Putin and Prigozhin go back quite a ways to when Putin was still deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the 1990s.
Just after the fall of the Soviet Union. Yeah.
Which is a time for any like ambitious young sort of operative within what is now the Russian Federation to kind of make a name for yourself and sort of find a niche within this new state, which of course Putin ends up becoming president. But you know, if you meet a young, ambitious guy like Putin, you feel like, oh, if I just sort of attach my whatever to this guy's rise, maybe something good will come out of it. That's sort of what happened here. But Prigozhin himself, like his backstory is quite interesting.
Definitely. From private schools to Siberian prisons, all the way to the heights of the Moscow dining scene, and finally into private military. He's got a lot of different facets.
Yeah. I think the world would have been better off if he had stayed as a hot dog man. You know what I mean? Like,
would have saved us all a lot of trouble, definitely.
But, you know, through it all, it's always his connection with Putin, I feel like, that stands out, because as Putin's star rises, he rises along with him.
Definitely, it opened a lot of doors for him. Previous to his meeting with Putin, you notice that he was just sort of a thug. Robbing people on the streets of St. Petersburg. I believe there's a story about him where he would run up behind women and steal the earrings out of their ears, and the wallets out of their purses. And that's not exactly, the shining lights of Russian society.
Or even in terms of crime, that's like the lower ends of the spectrum. Like,
it's not exactly organized.
Yeah, when there was people making millions of dollars at the time, like oligarchs, and here's a guy who's just doing petty crimes.
Yeah,
but it's not quite clear how he sort of made it from prisoner to hot dog man to restaurateur to friend of Putin. But what we do know is that after he came out of prison, he sort of tapped into some family connections because his family was running like a hot dog stand or like a sausage stand in a public square in St. Petersburg. So, he was in prison for a couple of years, and then when he got out, he was like, I'm going to maybe play it straight for a while. He went to his family, and all of a sudden he took over running this hot dog business. And like any good entrepreneur, he was like, how can we maximize the profits? Which is tough to do with hot dogs, but
it turns out maximizing the profits for hot dogs in Russia includes getting involved with the Russian mob.
Yeah.
He connected with a guy from his past named Boris Spector, and also a fellow named Mikhail Mirashvili, who would go on to be arrested for torturing multiple people to death in order to retrieve his father who'd been kidnapped. So you can get a sense of who this guy was and who this guy was associating with at the time. That really opened a lot of doors just in terms of real estate. Mm-hmm. He was able to expand and buy some of the properties that would really allow his star to rise, including the Paradise Island restaurant, which is just a beat-up boat on the side of the St. Petersburg River. The river in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, it kind of just shows his ingenuity. For whatever his faults, clearly he's not a great person, but to have the idea, whether or not he had outside backing or influence or whatever, but to have the idea to get sort of a dilapidated houseboat and turn it into one of the nicest fine dining restaurants in St. Petersburg takes some guile, at the very least.
Yeah, some skill. Restaurants have an 80% failure rate, and somehow this guy was able to beat the odds. Just
sort of putting the pieces together, you have to feel like something changed in his life between petty criminal, hot dog salesman to restaurateur. At some point in there, he made the right connections with people.
There is that very famous picture of him standing in the background while Putin signs, meets with Hillary Clinton. And George W. Bush. And you get the sense that this guy has always sort of been in the background, or he's been there for a long time. And having read deeper into him, I get the sense that he was sort of the criminal connection, sort of the fixer for Putin.
I think he was also very good at putting on a good sort of front or being a front for other people. That seemed to be one of his skills. He basically would say to people, hey, I can run this thing for you. I'll be the figurehead. And, you give me all the resources, but it won't be easy to draw a connection between you and this organization if you let me run. Yeah. That seemed like something that was a common thread.
You look at his restaurant chain, and my personal favorite part of his story, Blindonald's.
Really on the nose there.
Yeah. What if we combine Blini and McDonald's? And I think the original business plan was to have 12 restaurants. I think maybe 4 or 5 of them opened at the end. And they were all considered to be incredibly inconsistent in terms of their service and food quality, as well as completely disgusting in terms of cleanliness. And that was right around 2011. He opened the Yevgeny food manufacturing plant, which was specifically supposed to make food for Russian students. Again, the food was extremely inconsistent, extremely salty, and not very good in terms of quality. But it was a good business, and it was a good sort of stepping stone. After about a year doing that, he moved into, he gained another government contract in terms of providing military rations. That Yevgeny food plant lasted about a year. A Forbes reporter went back in 2013. As a reminder, it opened in 2011 and discovered that it was completely abandoned besides roughly 12 people. There was no manufacturing happening, and no one had seen a paycheck in months.
I mean, but it's quite a step down to go from fine dining to, cafeteria food. Like I'm just curious, like how, I mean, obviously, I think really how it started, maybe we should backtrack a little bit. It was like when he was working at these fine dining restaurants in St. Petersburg was when he first met Putin, who was deputy mayor at the time. And they sort of first established this connection. Putin, I think, actually liked his food. Which
that says more about Putin's taste than anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I don't know that much about what Russian fine dining might entail. I'm assuming he was making a lot of, which is kind of ironic now to think about it, but probably making a lot of Western European dishes, French food, Italian food, things that were considered fine dining in the traditional sense. And what's ironic about that now is that Putin is so, pro everything Russian that it would be probably embarrassing for you to go back, look and say, hey, Putin, what about, back in whatever, the early 2000s when you were eating, foie gras and frog's legs and pasta. It's like, it's not so Russian, but it did start off as this genuine friendship where Putin was sort of like, hey, you're like a good chef or cook or whatever. I mean, who knows if he was actually cooking this food himself, but
seems doubtful.
Yeah.
But at least he owned it and seemed to have a lot of connections with it.
I think it was just sort of like one of those moments where it's like real recognize real. It's like Putin's like, you're sort of this guy who's ambitious and will stop at anything to get what you want, and that's the way I am. So why don't we work together and we can both get what we want?
Well, a big part of of Putin's background was being in the KGB. And they oftentimes did leverage criminal connections. That was a large part of their MO, was leveraging criminal connections in order to get things done. So I can't help but think that maybe he was also leveraging that.
Well, especially in that post-fall of the Soviet Union world where the mob was like essentially more powerful than the Russian state for a while there.
Certainly got more powerful.
Yeah. So in that case, it was sort of like, what is this new Russia going to look like? An alliance between the mob and the most cutthroat politicians, which is kind of how it turned out. So, they, I don't know if it was just, one day Putin was at the restaurant and Prigozhin made him a particularly delicious, cabbage soup or something, or borscht. And he was like,
very good borscht.
He was like, okay, you and me, we're going to go places together,
Well, my sense of things is that, like, he seemed to have these connections, and maybe it was that he saw the people who were dining there, right? Like, he seemed to be connected to that guy, Dmitry Utkin, who would go on to be the military leader of Wagner, who is basically looks like he's straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
He's got a shaved head, has SS lightning bolts tattooed on his collarbones. He's about as evil as you could possibly get. And if you're, someone who's interested in rising into power, has come out of the KGB, like, meat grinder, for lack of a better word, you get the sense that maybe he's the kind of guy that you want to know. He's the guy who can get things and get things done, right?
Yeah, and Utkin seems like the real, at least ideological founder of the Wagner Group. And he said he even said that he named it after his favorite composer, which is not so subtle way of saying, oh, he also happens to be Hitler's favorite composer. So it tells you all you need to know.
Seriously.
Which again is another great irony of this war, right? Because the Russians keep calling the Ukrainians Nazis and neo-Nazis, and they're saying we're stopping the Nazi regime in Kiev, and it's like when one of your top units is literally named after Hitler's composer
and has SS lightning bolts tattooed on him.
You can't quite claim the high ground at that point.
That is sort of the irony of the Wagner Group in total, is that they're so perfectly movie villain evil. Right? That like everything they do, from their insignia to their uniforms, everything is so movie villain bad guy. It's very hard to pitch them as the heroes of the story.
But I feel like maybe we should distinguish, just for the listeners, like within Wagner Group, there's like two distinct types of troops, right?
Without a doubt.
Yeah. There's highly professionally trained soldiers who are in the A troop, who have previous experience fighting around the world, and these are sort of the officers, the troops that they use for things that are really important. And it turns out that a lot of them that are serving in Africa are ex-French Foreign Legion, which is something interesting that we can get into later. But it's just like, these are the guys they speak multiple languages, they're highly trained. A lot of the times they have their own gear, and these are actually some of the best soldiers, not only within Russia, but like just in terms of around the world. Professional fighters.
Come out of both the Russian security apparatus as well as security apparatuses around the world, and then combined with that, you have those K troops, which are prisoners. Yeah, and those are the prisoners that we heard Prigozhin addressing earlier in the episode. They were the ones who were going directly to the front lines. No gear, no training. They're basically handed a contract, they sign it, and then they're sent to the front line. Yeah. Those are the ones we hear calling their families saying, we haven't seen a paycheck or a magazine of ammo in the last 3 months.
Well, I think it's much easier to guarantee that somebody is going to be freed from prison and go home if their chance of survival is close to none. But,
especially a Russian prison, they're not exactly known for being reformative. Nice.
No, I mean, I honestly, personally, I would do anything if somebody came to provide the gulag and said, "Hey, this is your one chance to get out." I would say, well, I'd rather die in the Ukrainian mud than, just go through this hellish experience that I'm about to go through. I mean, if you're serving 5 years for breaking a vodka bottle on someone's head, then maybe you could tough that out. But if you're doing 20 to 30 years in a gulag, you're basically dead for all, Yeah. These are some evil bastards, and it's kind of backfiring too in a way, because some of the guys did actually make it. Some of the K troops, they made it through battle and they fulfilled their contract and they were freed. And now they're going back to Russia and committing more crimes, horrible crimes.
There was that video from, I believe it was Rostov, of some Wagner soldiers in a hotel just tearing the place apart with their bare hands.
They're clearly wasted, but also just insane.
Just the fact that even within normal Russian society, that's not acceptable. They're being released back out into public.
Yeah.
And especially given the experience that they're having, where they're being thrust into just the very front lines, into some of the most brutal fighting in the last 20 years. You look at Bakhmut, this is the most brutal thing that they can do, and they're just being released. They have sort of acted as an arm of the Russian security apparatus for the last 15, 20 years, deploying to places like Africa, Syria, and Venezuela to secure mineral rights and provide some form of economic colonialism in a way that a lot of states wish they could do.
While also kind of keeping themselves separate. Sorry to interrupt. No. While also making it so that the Russian state can somewhat separate themselves from these activities, right? Because they can say, "Oh, it's not Russia, it's the Wagner Group," or whatever they're called now. I think they were actually reorganized in Africa as the Africa Corps, which is again way too on the nose. Come on, guys. But I mean, it was only during the Ukraine war that Prigozhin publicly acknowledged that A, that they existed, and B, that he was the founder and leader. Because before that, it was all deny. So it was only during the battle for Bakhmut, when Prigozhin started to get pissed off, that he took to social media and was basically "I am Yevgeny Prigozhin. I am the leader. Where is the ammo? These people are dying."
There's a very famous video of him accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense, including Sergei Shoigu, the actual Minister of Defense, along with General Beremasov.
Yeah.
Of not providing ample materials
which is kind of unheard of. I mean, in like Russia in general, but I think he really was getting fed up because, they required Wagner A troops to actually take Bakhmut at the end of the day. The regular Russian army wasn't getting it done. And his men had to basically be called in. They tried using Chechens. They tried using the regular Russian army, and it was a failure. And so his troops, I mean, really why they started recruiting the K troops and the prisoners was because he was like, I can't lose any more A troops. Yeah. Like, there's only so many professional soldiers that you can lose.
Also, the A troops present a very interesting concept, which is that, like, it's sort of an admittance that the Russian military is not very advanced, it's not very modern. You look at photos and videos of them, and they appear to be using arms and AK-74s that were built in like the mid-90s, still using the tin pot helmets. Then you see pictures of both Wagner troops as well as Ukrainian troops who are being supplied by Americans. They're wearing extremely modern body armor and helmets.
Night vision too is a big deal.
Exactly. Yeah. Night vision and thermals as well.
Yeah.
Huge, very modern pieces of technology. And so they have sort of become like this modern wing of the Russian military, whereas the actual Russian military, like the state-supplied military, is sort of a paper tiger. Right?
Yeah. Well, especially as it turns out, they're like all of their most modern tanks. I mean, recently there was a video of one of the most modern Russian tanks being destroyed by American-supplied Bradley, which isn't really supposed to be fighting tanks. Well, the type of corruption that happens in the Russian army is, because everything's still structured based on Soviet times. So everything is still based on the hierarchy of leadership. They don't have NCOs, which has always been the biggest difference between Western military and, say, China or Russia, is that everything flows through the top commander. And if they're corrupt, basically the entire unit or division is going to be screwed.
I mean, traditionally, especially in the post-Soviet era, they operate as a kleptocracy, right? Like, we call them an oligarchy because they're very identifiable agents, like Roman Abramovich and Yevgeny Prigozhin in this case, who are extremely rich and have a lot of power. But really, what we're looking at is a kleptocracy where they're just like picking the pocket of the working person to enrich themselves. I just happened across a very interesting statistic that I had forgotten about, which is that at the height of the Wagner Group's involvement in Bakhmut, about 20% of the troops there, of Russian troops in Ukraine, were supplied by Wagner.
Wow, that's a high number.
A striking amount. Yeah. Striking amount. That's in an operational area of 100,000, 120,000 men. That's easily 20,000, 30,000 men. That's a large fighting force. That's enough to take a city.
Yeah.
So you can't help but wonder, like, how did this guy really go from what role did he operate in, and how did he get how much power did he really have? How much power did he not have? Especially given that he then turned around and sort of bit the hand that fed him, right?
Yeah, no, I never quite understood that move just from a but maybe we should walk it back a little bit and sort of take people into how between the actual founding of Wagner and the full scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, because its role changed a lot once the Ukraine war started, because before that, like you were saying earlier, they were sort of this arm of the Russian state that protected Russian interests. And in one very famous episode, they were protecting a Syrian Assad state-backed oil field in Syria. And essentially, we thought we were fighting, Syrian troops, but as it turned out, they were Wagnerites. And there's audio out there of Wagner troops who were basically saying, "Oh no, the Americans have found us," and then they
were bombing them. Right?
Yeah.
We were not quite prepared for like a modern fighting force.
Yeah, because up to that point, they had basically just been fighting rebels and ISIS. They actually, to their credit, fought ISIS quite a lot in Syria, but only only because they are beholden to Assad. And, Russia was propping up Assad, for those who don't know.
They were actually providing securing a lot of those resources, especially in Syria. Mm-hmm. They were providing the security, and through that, they were sort of gaining control of these mines, of these natural resources, both in the Middle East and in Africa, actually. Mm-hmm. They're still operating in Africa, and we can touch on that a little bit later.
Yeah. It's kind of how they operate. It's almost like a classic mafia racket. It's like we give you protection in exchange for a percent of whatever it is,
Well, to be fair, America has been guilty of this as well. It's a form of economic colonialism where you overpromise to the point where the host country signs on to a deal that's much greater than their GDP can support. And so they're forced to subsidize their own raw materials to pay off those loans or that protection. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so instead of instead of cash payments, they're given like mining rights, drilling rights to these like resource-rich regions. Like in Syria, you'll see oil. In Congo, you'll see a lot of rare earth minerals and diamonds. Mm-hmm. And these are all very important, especially to a place like Russia that does not have a ton of industry, but has sort of built its fortune on raw materials.
Yeah, well, especially gold, especially since the sort of sanctions have been kicking in. Gold is one of the only ways that they can do business.
Also, coltan, rare earth minerals like coltan and cobalt, which America is quite poor in. So they can sort of use it as a bargaining chip. Mm-hmm. But to provide that security, and America has also provided that security for a lot of countries. And done the exact same thing. So I can't exactly say that we are.
Yeah, but if you're going to choose between the sort of the big three, right? Like if you're an emerging nation, and if you had to choose between China, Russia, and the U.S., we're still the best deal out there. You know what I mean? Because China is just going to basically bankrupt you, and then just like you were just explaining, overpromise, and then make you go really deep into debt for these massive infrastructure projects, like stuff that are part of Belt and Road. And then once you can't pay, they say, oh, well, you can basically pay us in kind with these, either like in China, a big thing for them is fishing rights. Because they don't, they have a population that needs a lot of food, and they need to import a lot of food.
They are the largest importer of food and the largest importer of energy resources in the world.
Yeah.
Which I think is a shocking fact to a lot of people.
It's not great to be a superpower that imports everything.
Without a doubt, yeah. They've really struggled. They have no natural oil resources. So that's a big thing.
Yeah.
They've actually been sort of the ones that have propped up Russia through this war because they've continued to buy Russia's crude oil. Mm-hmm. I believe it was about a year into the war, maybe a year and a half into the war, he decided there was a striking moment as the battle for Bakhmut raged on and seemed to sort of turn into this World War I style battle of attrition. He went onto Twitter, I believe, or onto the Russian state television, and basically
it could have been Telegram, something like that. Yeah.
I basically produced a video saying that the Russian state has abandoned Wagner despite them being an arm of the security apparatus.
А теперь слушайте меня, сука, блядь. Это чьи-то, блядь, отцы и чьи-то сыновья. И те, которые не дают нам боеприпасы, сука, будут в аду жрать их потроха, блядь.
Accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense of not providing the material resources necessary to fight this war, and then turning around and instead of plunging deeper into Ukraine, sent a column of tanks and troops towards Rostov-on-Don.
Yeah, and then eventually Moscow was their final destination.
Well, the state's final destination.
Yeah, I think they made it pretty close before he called it off, because there's videos of Wagner armor and like on the road outside of Moscow. But there was even, I think, incidents of Wagner anti-air shooting down Russian aviation.
I believe you're right about that. Yeah, and it's very interesting that like a guy who went from calling Putin Papa to a guy rolling tanks down, the main street of Russia.
Yeah, I mean,
of Moscow.
I mean, Rostov is also one of Russia's largest military hubs, close to the Ukrainian border.
Yeah, they're their main logistical hub.
Yeah, yeah. So losing that would have actually just losing that alone would have been a huge blow.
He effectively took it. So the question is, what happened in that room between him and Putin to make him stop? Like, I think a lot of very smart people, smarter than me, theorized that he was essentially promised Belarus as a sort of a personal thief.
Well, there's also speculation at the time that Lukashenko was in poor health.
As well as Putin, questions about Putin's health. There's ongoing conspiracy theories that he has Alzheimer's, and he actually did go under the knife during the beginning of the offensive for stomach cancer, I believe.
It's also sort of been proven that he has multiple body doubles out there.
Oh, without doubt.
I mean, there's a lot of guys in Russia that look like Putin.
Yeah. So the question I have to ask is, like, what happened in that room? What was said between the two that made this guy, who was very popular and sort of seemed like the heir apparent to Putin, suddenly stop in his tracks? And not just like stop in his tracks, but turn around and sort of re-engage. Like, that is a striking movement.
I think what really scared Putin was and Prigozhin's main leverage was how popular he was with the soldiers and the sort of grunts in the army, because a lot of these guys, I mean, especially the like prisoner, units, he literally, a lot of them he basically saved. And he also, in some of the speeches, I don't think we played that exact one, but in some of the speeches he gave, he said, I was once a prisoner like you. Cause like we said earlier, he did do some time. So he was able to relate to these troops maybe in a way that Putin was not. And that kind of scared him, and that was really his leverage. But like, for somebody like Prigozhin, who knows Putin so well, and how much of a ruthless killer he is, because Prigozhin obviously was let in to the sort of the inside the Kremlin, so he knew what was going on. So
he definitely was like sort of to perhaps be a little too erudite here, but he was sort of someone who'd risen from like the plebeian to the patrician, right?
Yeah, yeah. But like, if you know all that, why would you ever stop your coup and think that Putin wasn't going to try everything in his power to then kill you? Like, if you know this man, you know what he's capable of, you know how ruthless he is, why would you expect him to not treat you in the same way after you've already betrayed him, basically? Like, it's kind of confusing.
He seemed to sort of walk away from this idea, and think that no one else was going to hold a grudge. Like, apparently he didn't interact too much with the KGB.
But Putin was the case, it's like
because they are the masters of holding a grudge.
Yeah, and also how many rivals and enemies of Putin in the last 10 or so years have either fallen off a balcony or been poisoned, shot, or even in foreign countries they can reach you. So if he's thinking, why would he think that wouldn't then apply to him after he'd done such a betrayal?
When the plane was shot down in the Kyivskaya Oblast, he gave a press conference.
И для себя, и тогда, когда я его просил об этом для общего дела, как вот в эти последние месяцы, Он был талантливый человек, талантливый бизнесмен. Работал не только у нас в стране и с результатом работал, но и за границей, в Африке в частности.
He immediately began referring to him in the past tense. He said, this was a person with a complicated fate. He made some serious mistakes in life, but he also achieved necessary results. That's someone who has a cold view of the world.
Yeah, yeah.
What does that say about Putin, and what does that say about him as an international player and an international opponent on a larger field?
Yeah. Well, I mean, every time the West underestimates him, that's a mistake we made. After Putin took Crimea, everybody was like, oh, he'll probably be done with that. I mean, when somebody says in public, in speeches, I want to recreate the Russian Empire, he's not just bullshitting. Like, he genuinely means that. So, most Ukrainians, when you talk to them, for them, the war started in 2014 with the sort of little green men and first the annexation of Crimea, which we shamefully the world basically said we don't care, which in my view enabled Putin a lot.
Without a doubt.
Because once he realized that he could basically get away with that without anything happening, why wouldn't he just keep going? I think that was a kind of a shameful moment, and it's what led to the sort of fake uprisings in Luhansk and Donetsk, and the sort of the Russian annexation through a fake paramilitary force. But yeah, I mean, we were talking more about the end of Prigozhin, which didn't he say something? Didn't he sort of basically say that Prigozhin was drunk on the plane and pulled the pin to a grenade, or was it somebody else on the plane?
The official story was a myocardial infarction by the pilot, and then it was shot down. And then when it was very quickly proven by UN investigators and just by open source intelligence agents that was inaccurate, that it was clearly shot down, because I believe there is a video.
There is, yeah. There's a random, video of some person shooting video in their field, and you see a missile.
Yeah.
You see the plane flying, and then you see a missile come out of the ground and shoot, and the plane goes down. I mean, it's there, clear as day.
Although, I mean, Russia does have sort of a long history of accidentally shooting down.
Yeah, accidentally in quotes. Yeah. Often they seem to be shooting down their own choppers and planes.
Especially recently.
Yeah.
They just shot one down.
Yeah, a big one too. It was I forget what the designation is, but I know it was a big transport plane.
Yeah, full of Ukrainian
yeah,
which will probably inflame and lengthen the war.
Yeah. But just this morning, the Ukrainians sunk another Russian ship in the Black Sea with these genius sort of remote controlled boats that are just packed to the gills with explosives. Yeah. And they just detonate. And after the 2016 election, there was accusations flying around, mostly from the Democrats, of election meddling on behalf, basically by Russia on behalf of the Republican Party, because for obvious reasons they viewed Trump as their preferred candidate. And many instances, Trump has referred to Putin as a smart guy, a great leader, brilliant, all kinds of things that a murderous dictator should not be referred to as.
Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart, to which I was greeted with, oh, that's such a terrible thing to say. I'd like to tell the truth. Yes, he's smart.
And he's also just like, well, we need to negotiate with them. So they were obviously really hoping for a Trump presidency. And when the U.S. Congress, started looking into this, they in their reports, they sort of singled out Prigozhin as one of the biggest sort of culprits on the Russian side of the election interference. And that sort of takes us back to how Prigozhin found himself in that type of situation. Mose, do you want to explain what the Internet Research Agency is?
So the Internet Research Agency was also known as the Troll Farms. A lot of young Russian men, many of whom were college educated with liberal arts, what we would consider liberal arts degrees, many of whom were actually gay, who had been arrested for their sexuality and had been sort of put up to the task by the Russian intelligence apparatus of fomenting divisive issues within within sort of the U.S. cultural sphere. I believe there was a New York Times article referencing the fact that it did happen on both sides, but mostly happened on the right. A Russian publication called Fotonka reported about it in 2014, in May of 2014, that the Concord Catering Group, which was Yevgeny Prigozhin's catering group and sort of corporate entity, was directly involved with the IRA and was actually charged by the U.S. government with operating a covert social media campaign and creating discord within public opinion. The Concord Group was in fact indicted by Robert Mueller and his investigation. He was sanctioned by the Treasury Department, but never extradited, or nothing really happened because, again, he is part of the Russian security state apparatus, so it was unlikely that anything was going to happen to him.
He basically laughed the whole thing off, and he was like, yeah, we did it, but there's nothing you can do about it, right?
He was actually quoted as saying by the RIA Novosti news agency, "Americans are very impressionable people. They see what they want to see. I treat them with great respect. I'm not at all upset that I'm on this list. If they want to see the devil, let them see him."
Very poetic from the man himself.
Yeah.
It's almost like he knew that he was a Bond villain and he just leaned into it as hard as he possibly could.
This is a guy who's also quoted by the Institute for the Study of War as saying, "Gentlemen, we interfered, we interfere, and we will interfere. Carefully, precisely, surgically. And in our own way, as we know how. During our pinpoint operations, we'll remove both kidneys and the liver at once."
Again, very poetic and oddly descriptive.
But at the same time, very thuggish and very to the point. And these are not, edited or paraphrased in any way. These are direct quotes from the man himself.
Which is what makes it so strange when people here domestically want to say, oh, the whole Russian interference thing was a hoax, when you have the guy who was in charge literally claiming it, and not only claiming it, but basically bragging about how they were able to influence the American public. When you have this guy saying this stuff, it's not, he knows that nobody can touch him, so he can basically just say whatever he wants.
The derision that he has for the American people is palpable.
Well, there's of course the theories that he's living comfortably in Bermuda and he's, his death was all fake, but I tend to not believe that. But
it would strike me as very surprising.
Well, he's there with Tupac and Bob Marley and all the other people that are not dead but are dead. Sure. That would be quite a smoke sesh.
That is a nightmare conversation right there. I will interfere.
It's always to the left, Yevgeny. How many times did I tell you?
Yeah, he's like, the left is where the Nazis are. I must pass to the right.
Yeah, but he's just like such a fascinating guy. I mean, others have put it this way, but like to go from this sort of thug hot dog salesman, just imagine a Central Park hot dog vendor, right? Goes from that to being essentially like one of the second or third most powerful people in the U.S.
During like ballpark hot dog vendor to Secretary of Defense.
Yeah. Or like more like the president's secret mistress.
Yeah.
Like that has a lot of, because he exerts power from the shadows.
Yeah.
Oh God. Much less sexy. when it's a guy who looks like Igor. I have brought you a brain. Yes.
I have bought you borscht, and believe me.
But like, could the guy actually cook? I mean, that's my question. Like, was he a chef or was he just a total fraud?
He was just a
businessman. Yeah, I mean,
I don't think blini how hard could blini be to make?
Yeah.
And in my experience in the restaurant world, most restaurant owners don't know how to cook. They can boil an egg.
Yeah, which is often a problem.
Yeah, and that's destroying restaurants, but that's a matter for another episode.
These kinds of troll farms, though, that we're talking about, it's important that that people can visualize, like, these are the kinds of things where they have hundreds and hundreds of phones and laptops in a room or a warehouse, and they're operating dozens and hundreds of Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, whatever, just name it.
Just posting the most divisive things.
Yeah.
And from both sides. I think that there was a misconception that it was entirely on one side of the political spectrum.
They don't care. They don't even know what they're saying. They just know that what they're saying is controversial.
What I find very interesting is that that's actually almost out of the Kremlin playbook from the Cold War, from the Soviet era. There was a book that essentially stated that the best strategy for Russia was to divide America.
Oh, was that the Dugin guy?
Maybe Dugin. That sounds correct. I'll have to Google it at a later point.
Putin takes him as one of his biggest inspirations.
But essentially, he said you should divide America along economic, racial lines, and then attempt to split the Britain away from the rest of Europe, and then divide Europe.
Great success.
Yeah, we're kind of killing it, but it's very interesting that this strategy has stuck around for so long.
No, I mean, I don't want to get conspiratorial, but the October 7th attack was very well timed for Russia. Let's just say that. I mean, Iran is a close ally of Russia, and Hamas is a close ally of Iran. So, as soon as that attack happened, the entire world's focus shifted from Ukraine to Israel, and that benefits one nation more than anyone else.
Ironically, it's a nation that is in sort of constant descent, right?
Yeah.
Like, they have the worst brain drain. They have the highest use of hard drugs.
Yeah.
Constant crime. A failing kleptocratic economy. Like, they are not like.
Well, they're also really, really worried about their demographics, as they should be. Yeah. But one of the worst things that they're doing in Ukraine actually is, in the occupied territories, they're sending in hundreds of thousands of their own citizens to sort of take over, and it's something similar that they did in the Baltics, because I have friends in Estonia, and before 1945, the Russian-speaking population of Estonia was like 5%. Now in 2023, it's 30%.
That's striking. That is striking.
Yeah, and that was just because of how many ethnic Russian people were brought into the country during the Soviet occupation. But I mean, that's
always sort of been Russia's strategy, right? That they take over a place and then they move the native population out, as they're doing with their controlled parts of Ukraine, and moving ethnic Russians in, then can claim that it's sort of an ethnic Russian enclave.
One of the most dastardly things they're doing is taking, I don't know the number, it's in the thousands of young, mostly orphans that are dead, whose parents are dead mostly because of Russia. And they're taking these orphans and essentially forcing them to go to Russia. And they get adopted into Russian families mostly in Siberia or in the middle of Russia, not European Russia, and like it's sort of, it's obviously a war crime, but it's ethnic cleansing.
They've done this. The interesting and sort of horrible thing is that they've done this in the past. If you read Svetlana Alexandrovich's book Chernobyl, a lot of the survivors of the Chernobyl incident describe being evacuated from Pripyat and actually being sent to Armenia and the far reaches of Siberia, far outside anything that they could possibly know, or any cultural bounds that they might have. They were sent to Kyrgyzstan and a lot of these what we would now consider Central Asian satellite states. Yeah, just the fact that Russia had so much logistical power and so much territory that they could displace these people, and that they're still sort of acting like that is the best way to manage a country and manage a population is very concerning.
Maybe we should just wrap up by talking a little bit about where Wagner is now post Prigozhin. He was obviously the head And Wagner, essentially, as it used to be, has ceased to exist since his death. He was the figurehead, and essentially what's happened is since his death, it's been incorporated. Most of the elements of Wagner have just been directly incorporated into the Russian state.
Yeah, all pretense of a separate group and sort of plausible deniability have been dropped, and they are now just part of the Russian army.
But it's very important that they continue to hold on to their, especially the Central African Republic, because they pretty much exert total control over the country in all intents and purposes. They have a large military force, which the Russian state, let's be real, has a large military force there, and they provide bodyguard services for the president, and they administer most of the large mines and resource extracting, in the country. So they
provide a lot of security in South America, including security for Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela.
Yeah,
and so they're sort of playing a role in American politics, whether by hook or by crook, right?
Yeah, and I think it's very important for Putin to maintain these international forces, because it allows him to at least feel like he can be a player in the world, where he can affect things around the world the way the U.S. can, or other, large powers can, so it's important for them to continue this foreign sort of exerting influence in these countries. But it's going to be tough because, for as much as Putin probably hated Prigozhin after he betrayed him, he was a very effective puppet and a very effective agent for Putin, because he was savvy and he knew how to lie and he knew how to manipulate people. And he was also very good at keeping everything under wraps. He was always denying that Wagner has anything to do with Russia. And, it's going to be a lot tougher they basically given up on it, but it's going to be a lot tougher to deny culpability with Russia, and their foreign assets now that Prigozhin's gone.
And as I said at the top of the episode, my suspicion after learning more and more about both the Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin himself is that he is just sort of a criminal fixer who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Like, we sort of pitched him as this movie villain bad guy because he sort of, the shoe fit kind of perfectly. He sounds like it, he looks like it, and we sort of say, like, as I said, if the shoe fits. But I don't actually think that he was all that intelligent, and that he was just sort of a thug who happened to be Putin's right-hand man.